right, welcome to the show. This is the Shatter the Script podcast. The STS Poll Week 10 is out. It's the official rankings from myself, Jared May. If you're a first-time listener, thanks for joining in. I really appreciate the recent support on the channel. So if you like this and you want to share with your friends, you can find us on YouTube at Shatter the Script, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter, formerly or now known as X. You can all find us at Shatter the Script or STS_pod. Look, we're going through the top 25 STS Poll Week 10 analysis here, kind of counting down in a more organized fashion, 25 down to 1, highlighting the teams that need to be spotlighted. So you'll see the graphic shown here in just a second. And then from there, I've got a couple things in bold that I'd like to go through for each for some teams within the top 25 that I think are worth noting. Some are playing each other this upcoming week, and I think that'll transition us into the key final projections to wrap up this episode. And then so just timeline-wise, STS Poll first with, the analysis that comes with it. That's going to take, 20 to 25 minutes or so. That's the primary portion. We're going to talk a little Brian Kelly, a little Lane Kiffin, a little head coaching carousel going there, and the open portions of teams that are looking for a coach, the teams that are actively searching for one, and then we'll go into final projections. So, with that being said, if you are a first-time listener and you haven't seen the STS poll up in person, well, you're in for a ride here. So, this is my favorite thing to do on the podcast thus far, is contribute within those that help out with the pod and come up with, primarily myself, come up with a top 25 ranking per week, a consensus board, if you will. You get your API poll, you get your API poll, you get your coaches poll, you get your Josh Pate poll. You get them all, right? And so when you look at it in terms of an independent creator coming out here, at first glance, you're going to go, I don't know what this guy's talking about. I don't know where this guy's coming from. I don't know what this guy's background is. I don't know this guy. And so I come in here and say, whether you see it on TikTok, Instagram, I doubt you see it on Instagram because it doesn't expand past 200 views for some odd reason. If you've seen it on YouTube, if you've seen it anywhere, you're probably wondering who I am, right? Well, I'm the guy that doesn't have a paid-for agenda. I'm the guy that you go to if you want to debunk the mainstream media. I'm the guy that you go to if you want somebody to relate to that's possibly the same age as you. I'm 25 years old. Somebody that has played football, somebody who has family members that played football, brothers specifically, somebody that studies the game, all these sorts of things, and somebody that watches the games, right? We all have busy lives. We all miss certain games that, we want to watch. Oh, we want to watch the Alabama game. But we don't see these other ones that slip into the cracks. And so when you see this ranking, as you're seeing now up on the board, you might question yourself and you go, well, who the hell is M? That's Memphis. Who is Tulane? Why is Tulane? They're 6-1. They got a coach that's probably going to go get an upgrade this offseason. Iowa? What? Iowa? Yeah. So we're going to go into it. But you're in for a treat if this is your first time as well. I just added the just outside the script portion of the top 25 consensus board rankings because a lot of times people are asking me, why didn't you put this team in there? Why didn't you put this team? You can't fit the top 30 teams into the top 25. And if you're not a top 25 team, that doesn't mean you cannot eventually become one. Some of them were formerly top 25 teams, obviously. So just outside the script, we'll start there. You got Washington at 6-2. Washington, obviously, they lost to Ohio State earlier in the year. Ohio State, when I look at them, obviously they're number one on my consensus board, and they're not gonna have another test until, if you want to count Penn State, but Washington lost that game 24-6, and then they go in and they play, I want to say it was Michigan. And I'm drawing a blank here. It's a Monday. Sorry, boys. and Washington has Damon Williams, a quarterback for Washington, has played pretty phenomenally. He looks like he has upside potential. If you're looking forward to watching the Washington Huskies continue to play at an elite level next year in 2026, but they lost to Ohio State 24-6, and they lost to Michigan 7-24. But they play a top defense in Maryland and beat them 24-20. They put 38 on the Rutgers. They destroyed Illinois. And now they're heading to the bye week. So they haven't done enough for me to be convinced on the opportunities that they've been given, the resume that they have presented themselves. They haven't done enough yet to make their way back into the top 25. Utah's kind of the same way at 6-2. Utah has their only 2 losses are to the top 2 Big 12 contenders that I have listed, and that's Texas Tech and BYU. Now, you may have looked at the Texas Tech Utah scoreboard and said, oh, they got blown out. Well, for 2.5, 3 quarters, this was a tie ball game. This was a low-scoring ball game. And then all of a sudden, Texas Tech pulled away defensively. And they were leaning on their backup quarterback, Will Hammond, who did a phenomenal job that game to carry out a victory, in which they did. If you watched the Holy War, which some of you actually might have tuned into, that was a very methodical, slow, it was like watching a pregnancy. You're like, oh my God, 9 months of this? We don't know, 9 months of this. That's crazy. And so 24-21 was the final score of that game. BYU came out on top, and I'm still not sold on BYU, but at the same time, I can say the same thing about Utah. And so Utah is a big-time matchup upcoming this week versus Cincinnati, who I have ranked. But they haven't done enough with what they've been given to get into the top 25. And they have an upcoming matchup that constitutes an opportunity to get back into the top 25. Pittsburgh is a sleeper team, at 6-2, and their resume is just one to keep an eye on. That's why I have them highlighted here. The Pittsburgh Panthers at 6-2, nobody's talking about them. They lost to West Virginia in week 3. Obviously, I'm not going to clap my hands for that or defend them for losing by a touchdown to West Virginia. But then they come off a bye and they play Louisville, who is ranked on my board now, and they lose that game by 7 points as well. So back-to-back losses in 3 weeks, considering the bye week. They come out strong versus Boston College. They beat Florida State by 3. They blow out Syracuse, and then they blow out North Carolina State. And so they're playing Stanford this upcoming week. Then they hit another bye, and they play Notre Dame, Georgia Tech, and Miami. And so why I'm highlighting Pittsburgh, I don't believe they're going to be a top 25 in the season. But they're worth noting because they could easily be a spoiler for Notre Dame, Georgia Tech, and Miami to end the season. That's just something to keep an eye on. A lot like a Kansas State in the Big 12. They're 5-4, they're 4-4, something like that. And all of a sudden, Kansas State comes out and they're stripping away wins from top contenders in their conference. So I think that might be Pittsburgh this year. So just watch out. That's the fans are going to show up to the home games. They're playing Notre Dame at home and Miami at home. So the fans are going to show up to those home games in hopes that they have a chance to do something incredible, right? And by that time, Notre Dame's going to be probably top 10 per the AP poll, not my poll. Notre Dame will not touch the top 10. I promise you that. You Notre Dame fans are going to be super mad at that. That's why I call you guys the Whining Irish. But they're not going to touch the top 10. They have completed the tough part of their schedule, which is USC, Miami, and Texas A&M within the first 7 weeks. You want to throw Arkansas in there? Sure, throw Arkansas in there. They fired their head coach, and they have Bobby Petrino. They score 71, you score 72. That's what Arkansas is. Texas at 6-2. This is a very, very interesting one. Very interesting one. And we're going to get into that exclusively towards the end of the episode with my key game projections where they're playing Vanderbilt at home. And so they just came off a win versus Mississippi State. And Mississippi State scores a lot of points. They do. Their defense is not going to be up to par in terms of an SEC football team, but they have played Tennessee tough. They have beaten Arizona State. They played Texas tough, which is Texas, for for the type of offense that Texas has showcased thus far this season, which has been abysmal. Arch Manning has not looked very good. It's been a very rough going. The passing game stinks. They run constantly one-read progressions, screen throws, things like that. They haven't really gotten an established run game. They have been heavily dependent on their defense to win the football game against Oklahoma, to win in the football game in the past to be competitive against Florida, and all these different things. To win the game against Kentucky, which they had like less than 200 yards of offense and won that game. Arch Manning at a certain point was like 8 of 20 throwing the football. So I am not a fan of Texas's offense, but something clicked. Something clicked versus Mississippi State. And I'm not going to give them their flowers, but at 6-2, they're surviving at 6-2. That's another SEC win. No matter how you get them, SEC wins are hard to come by. And they were playing Mississippi State on the road. So, no, it's not that impressive, but it's worth noting they're not inside the top 25. They're just outside of it. But they have a big SEC top 10, per the STS poll, top 10 ranked opponent matchup coming up this weekend. At home. Arch Manning and concussion protocol. We'll get into that later. Okay, top 25. Here's where it starts. Number 25 is Iowa. Now, Iowa, here's something to consider when looking at Iowa. And I know you guys might think I'm crazy because the first thing that comes to your mind is Iowa cannot throw the football. Iowa can't do this. They're very boring. They're like the Steelers on steroids at the college level where, they finish 9-8 every year. And the equivalent of that would be 7-6 every year or 8-4 at best. And they might surprise you defensively at a home game where it's like 16-10 and they win. But something about Iowa. So they played Indiana within 5. They upset Penn State when they were 3-2. And they blew out 5-2 Minnesota this past week in week 9. Like 41-3. And now they have an overall record of 6-2. So deservingly, I think they find their way just barely into the top 25. And yeah, that might be a boring take, but we're all about resume at the Shatter the Script Network. We're talking about what have they done, what have they shown, and what kind of information can they provide for themselves to be within the top 25 teams in the country. Iowa has done that. Another team that has done that is Tulane. Tulane was in there last year. They're on a bye week. They're one of the few Group 5 teams that you can definitely put your faith in. They're playing Thursday this week at UTSA. It's coming off a bye week. I think that's going to be a dub for Tulane. But Tulane's head coach, I talked about him briefly last week, and I was literally told his name, and I totally forgot, and I don't want to sit here and look for it for 10 to 15 minutes. But Tulane at 6-1, probably moving on to 7-1 with a short week. I really think that that's going to be the leader for Group 5. And right in front of him is Memphis at 7-1, who just had a big comeback victory. Number 23, Memphis, big comeback victory versus South Florida. That was the big Group 5 matchup. Where it's like, well, could we like South Florida because they upset Florida early on in the year? They got blown up by Miami. Then they played this team good, and then played that team good, and they put up 70 against like North Texas, who's 7-1. Their only loss is to South Florida. So Memphis won the G5 Bowl, if you want to call it that. But eventually there'll be some cross references to go by. And there's going to be a lot of evening out and who's going to survive. Well, on top of that, we're talking about survivors, right? Within that American Conference, within that Group of 5 conference team is Navy at number 22. They're undefeated at 7-0. They're also coming off a bye week, and they're the last remaining undefeated G5 school remaining, playing within the American Conference. Now, that's going to end here in a few weeks when they play Notre Dame on NBC. Big-time televised matchup for Notre Dame. So a couple of grouped together, if you will, pun intended, Group 5 teams in a group of 3 within the top 25 here. So at 21, Missouri climbs all the way back. And so this is an interesting one in the SEC, and they have played all of their games within their conference to a very, very competitive level. They lost to Alabama by 3. They were tied within Vanderbilt very, very late in the game until Vanderbilt pulled away. And Pribula, the quarterback the prince who was promised, the Pribula who was promised, if you will, I do not recommend you go look up his injury. Okay? I do not recommend it. It was bad. I just got chills down my spine. I really feel for Pribula. That was a very, very gruesome injury. And I fear it might have been career-ending. And Pribula had a lot of promise. He was playing really great football. I think he would have given them the chance to beat Vanderbilt. But they fall to 6-2. And now you are working with I believe is a true freshman quarterback. I know he's number 5, and so you're going to ride with him. And he doesn't look bad. They're going to be a competent football team. They have an established run game with Ahmad Hardy, who's one of the best running backs in the SEC and in the country, behind Jeremiah Love and players like that. But a lot of questions going in with Missouri at 6-2. And, they have some tough matchups coming up. They're going to play A&M next week. And then I believe they have another tough matchup to end the year at a certain point. But something to keep an eye on there with Missouri, but they land at number 21. They were formerly number 15. Virginia, number 20. Virginia, if you've ever seen John Carter. They're at 7-1. And what I have written down for Virginia is survive and advance, because Virginia is quite literally on their last leg, and they're almost begging you, or begging the committee and begging me to unrank them at 7-1 despite their record. Because, you beat Stanford, you beat Florida State. That was their biggest win, was Florida State. Then they followed that up with a big win versus Louisville. You're like, holy crap, like Virginia has beaten both Florida State and Louisville back-to-back heading into the Week 7 bye. They come off the bye, and they barely escape Washington State. And Washington State got 50 points put on them. They lost by like 49 points to North Texas. And then Washington State then played Ole Miss super close. And so like within like one possession, and then they play Virginia within one possession. And then to follow that up with an even worse performance by Virginia in Week 9, they go at North Carolina, who has had an abysmal defense thus far, and barely escaped 17-16. So back-to-back within 3 victories for Virginia. And so they go into California, who's 5-3, and then they followed up with 5-2 Wake Forest, and then they go at Duke 4-3. I think they're gonna drop a game or two in these next 3 games before they hit their bye week in Week 13. But they are quite literally the definition of survive and advance. So I moved them back a little bit out of respect for Washington State and North Carolina to say, hey guys, you did your job to push them back a little bit in the rankings. So, I don't know. There's not a lot there for Virginia. They're not going to do any damage, in my opinion, but it's all, like I said, you're at the Shatter the Script Network. We're all about resume. That's what it's about. Number 19 is Michigan at 6-2. We have now entered the top 20. Number 19, Michigan at 6-2. Their 2 losses are to Oklahoma and USC. Both they lost by more than 2 possessions, or 2 or more possessions, better put. Their best wins are at Nebraska, who's currently 6-2. They won that game 30-27, and versus Washington, they won that game 24-7. Now, and I've talked about Michigan previously, and I'm going to talk about it in the same capacity. They are a competent Big Ten team who was run by an 18-year-old true freshman quarterback, Bryce Underwood, who was highly recruited, 5-star type guy, right? Dave Portnoy, Tom Brady got involved to recruit him over there. They have an established run game, and they have a head coach that I don't feel like truly belongs in Michigan long term. It's just kind of like an interim replacement for John Harbaugh after his departure to the NFL. So look for Michigan to, if they finish 8-4, 7-5, whatever's worse, right? I think they're going to move off of this coach, and that's no disrespect, because that guy's going to get probably a fantastic defensive coordinating job elsewhere within the Big Ten, or upgrading in a conference to the SEC, something like that. But I don't think that's the fit that they're looking for long term for the Michigan Wolverines. But nonetheless, they are at number 19. Number 18 And number 17, I have them in bold because they're playing each other this weekend. Number 18 is 6-2 Tennessee. And number 17 is 6-2 Oklahoma. Now, Tennessee, I have them behind Oklahoma. The AP poll does not. The AP poll has them in front of Oklahoma. I disagree heavily. Tennessee, based on the strength of schedule, is behind Oklahoma. And based on what they have done for wins, is behind Oklahoma. And based on how they have lost, is behind Oklahoma. So, I look at Tennessee in the same capacity. They just came off a victory versus Kentucky. And Tennessee's biggest problem, and we're going to get into this in the predictions at the end of the show, is defense. They can't stop a cold. They ran into that versus Mississippi State. They ran into that versus Georgia in week 3. They ran into that versus Arkansas, which a lot of people do. They ran into that versus Alabama, losing 20-37. And they ran into that versus Kentucky, allowing Kentucky to score 34 points. Can you name the Kentucky quarterback? No, you cannot. Neither can I. So now they go into a home game versus Oklahoma. So we'll get into the predictions of that later. But Oklahoma, on the other hand, and this is absolutely worth noting, and I'm sure you've heard it, whether you're on X, whether you're on Instagram, you see it 3-4 days late after X posts it, this kind of thing. But Oklahoma started their season off hot, right? John Mateer for Heisman, this, that, and the other. Then he has the thumb surgery. Then the Red River rivalry comes out, and John Mateer is 2 weeks off of a surgery on his throwing hand. So they lose that game. And that was an abysmal football game by John Mateer and the offensive line. And it was so defensively riddled by the Texas Longhorns that the score is an absolute facade. There was 3 interceptions by Mateer. Should have been 4 or 5. There were fumbles. There were sacks. There were mishaps on trick plays that gave Texas the ball in scoring position. Texas was very porous on offense during that game, and they still won the game 23-6. So Oklahoma lost that one 6-23. They had, that not a poor outing, but this is what Auburn does to everybody. They won 24-17 versus Auburn in week 4 at home, and Auburn just holds the football with Jackson Arnold, and they take control of time possession, and then they have a mediocre, an average defense, a competent SEC defense behind Hugh Freeze. And so that's always a misleading box score, but nonetheless, Oklahoma did their job, and they won. I mean, Auburn has played Georgia close. They've played OU close. They've played Texas A&M close. They're playing everybody close. It's just what they do. They just played Arkansas close. So then they respond from the Red River rivalry, and they go at South Carolina in what some coin as Cocktober, and beat them 26-7. And then they play at home versus Ole Miss. And this was credit to the analysts for projecting this game. This was a very competitive football game. OU took the lead late in the second half. OU climbed out of there, won 34-26. But look at the rest of OU's schedule. They go at Tennessee, have a bye week, go at Alabama, at home versus Missouri, and at home versus LSU to finish off the year. Good heavens. And I talked about it at the very beginning of the year. I even had a guest come on. I said, you guys are lucky if you finish 8-4. You're lucky. If you were finished 8-4, I'd still have you ranked 25. That schedule is brutal. And so we'll get into the key projections later of Oklahoma. But don't get me wrong. Oklahoma is a very good football team within their conference. But it is a battle-ravaged one. There's injuries. There's tough offensive opponents. So an unstoppable force meets an unmovable object. We'll get in object. That's what we'll get into at the end of the episode. All right, number 16, Houston. Number 15, Cincinnati. Number 14, Louisville. I call these the Reds. These are the red-branded football teams that have lined up all together. They're one-loss teams within their conferences. Louisville out of the ACC, Cincinnati and Houston out of the Big 12. So Houston is one you could argue, yes, they were in the top 25 last week. Yes, they increased their ranking this week in the STS poll. but their one loss is to Texas Tech. They got blown out, and their other wins they're not overly impressive. They just came off a 24-16 win over Arizona State. Arizona State has really struggled this year to stay healthy, especially at the quarterback spot. Sam Leavitt is a pretty competent quarterback within their conference. Connor Wegman is playing well for Houston. So for now, they're going to be landing at number 16, and right in front of them, I got Cincinnati at number 15, who is playing Utah, and we'll get into that projection later in the episode. Louisville at number 14, they're 6-1, eclipsing the top 15 out of the STS poll. Like, Louisville obviously upsetted Miami. They took every bit of advantage of the 3 or 4 interceptions that Carson Beck threw on a Friday night last week, or 2 weeks ago, if you will, if you're listening to this now. So I guess that timeline-wise, that makes sense. Miller Moss, a transfer from USC to Louisville, is now the starting quarterback for Louisville. They have a competent head coach. I keep using the word competent, but that is the best word to associate this team with. So Louisville is going to have, and they have an impressive resume as well. I've really liked what Louisville has done on paper. And so I believe their only loss is to who I mentioned earlier in the show was Virginia. So they beat Pittsburgh, they lost to Virginia, they beat Miami, and then they blew out Boston College. So, but they're about to get into a little bit. They have an interesting schedule, if you will. They only play 2 more over 500 win percentage teams on their schedule. I mean, it's Virginia Tech 3-5, California 5-3, Clemson 3-4. That would have been a tough game if Clemson was worth the shit this year. SMU at 5-3, and then an SEC game versus Kentucky. That's an in-state rivalry at 2-5. So you could easily see Louisville, eclipsing 10 double-digit wins in 2025. So something to definitely keep an eye on. Into the top 13. You have number 13, BYU at 8-0. Yes, I have them behind Texas Tech still, but number 13, I think, is an appropriate spot for BYU. I've watched a lot of their football games. I've already watched 4 from start to finish, staying up late, watching the Holy War, watching them versus Arizona, and just barely escaping by with these wins. And they start slow. They're a very methodical team. They're not as explosive as the BYU we saw last year. From just the eye test, and BYU is a strong contender. I believe they're the top 2 contender in the Big 12. I don't think these other teams are going to be able to keep up with BYU. You come out of the Holy War with a win. You come out of Arizona with an overtime win. And so I'd really like to see BYU go to band for band, bar for bar with Texas Tech. But I'm not sure we're going to see that unless I have that wrong and they're on their schedule, which I can source that later. But they just came off a blowout victory versus Iowa State, 41-27. Iowa State had the lead going into half, and then BYU just took off in the second half. I mean, it was demoralizing in the second half for Iowa State. Number 12, they're on a bye week, and this is a weird one. Number 12 is Notre Dame. And they're 5-2 currently. They're coming off their second bye week, and they're questionably ranked, as I've noted, inside the top 15. And so the reason I say they're questionably ranked is, and I've talked a lot about Notre Dame. I literally have an episode titled The Whining Irish. But they're the only team within the top 20 that only has 5 wins. They're one of the few teams that only has played 7 games. In terms of strength of schedule, I mean, like in their resume, they're one of the few teams that I've also made sort of an exception for. And they're also one of they are the only team that I have foreshadowed their schedule and just kind of made them, stapled them inside the top 15 because they're just not going. I'd just be genuinely shocked if they drop another football game. Genuinely shocked. So, I mean, they beat USC, they beat Arkansas, they lost to A&M by 1 early in the season, and then lost to Miami by 3, in week 1. So, and they played Texas A&M coming off a bye week. I took that away from them in terms of their resume. So, I really consider moving them back. But, they're on a bye week, and they play the rest of the year. We're going to see them probably finish 10-2, barring something fantastic, maybe a spoiler by Pittsburgh. But They are at number 12. Right in front of them, because of the head-to-head, is Miami at number 11. They are at 7-1. They kind of had a recovery against Stanford. Not much to talk about there. 42-7. They dropped a game 2 weeks ago to Louisville after throwing 4 interceptions, but they kind of seem to be back on track, and they're going to be a contender to win the ACC and contend for the ACC championship game versus Georgia Tech, barring Georgia Tech just completely collapsing. So, all right, the top 10. The top 10, number 10 is Texas Tech, 7-1. They didn't move from last week. They're going to be staying right where they're at. They had a shutout victory versus Oklahoma State, 42-0. Their backup quarterback, Will Hammond, is now out for the year with a torn ACL, which if you haven't been paying attention, he has filled in for multiple football games. He was the starting quarterback for the loss, their only loss in their schedule versus Arizona State at Arizona State, in which, that was I've talked about that one on the previous episode, but they are the strongest Big 12 contender in my opinion, based on their defensive strength, based on what they can do, the potential of what they can do with their starting quarterback. Morton is his last name. And to see what they can do versus BYU, I am just highly intrigued to see it, because I really think that Texas Tech would blow them out of the water. They've already done it against Houston. They've already done it against Utah. And so up next would be BYU, hopefully. Number 9 is Vanderbilt. Now, there's a little bit to talk about with Vanderbilt. There's been a lot of rumblings and stumblings and echoes that Diego Pavia should deserve a Heisman candidacy, a vote of confidence, if you will, to be a Heisman candidate. And I heavily, heavily, heavily disagree. Look at his stats within the SEC conference. Look at his numbers. You want to hear something crazy? Diego Pavia and Arch Manning, go look at their passing stats head-to-head. Completion percentage, touchdown to interception ratio, yards thrown. Now, basic stuff, right? I'm not a big, if you're listening to me for the first time, I am not a big box score / basic stat comparison guy. But I just stumbled across that because they're matched up this week, and I saw 15 touchdowns, 6 interceptions for both. I saw about the same amount of passing yards, less than 2,000. And I saw about the same amount of completion percentage versus the two. Now, Arch and Diego Pavia both have a rushing upside. So it'll be an interesting matchup going into that. But to say that Diego Pavia deserves a Heisman candidacy is just downright stupid, to be completely blunt with you guys. He's in his 10th year of college football as well. I'm a bit over him, but I do respect Vanderbilt as a team. I mean, they're coached well. They're firing on all cylinders, both defensively and offensively. They have won in different types of ways in each matchup, and then they won on the offensive side versus LSU. They won defensively versus Missouri. And so they've earned their top 10 spot for sure. But they got a big-time matchup going into Austin this weekend versus Texas. Number 8 is Oregon. Now, what people probably did not see this week, and Oregon is number 8 at 7-1. What they did not see this week is that they only beat Wisconsin 21-7. That's a boo-boo. That's a boo-boo. Wisconsin is not a good football team. And to only win by 2 touchdowns, 21-7, is a little bit of an eye-opener. Which is why, and I love Dan Lanning, and I love Dante Moore. Dante Moore was in my Heisman candidacy early on in the year, and those numbers are going to be inflated because of their schedule. And their schedule doesn't get much more difficult to end the year. But that's why I had Ole Miss at number 7. And Ole Miss is 7-1 as well. They're a one-loss SEC football team. So they just had a big-time road victory versus Oklahoma, and that's coming off of a game versus Georgia at home. And losing that game by 1 possession, in which they were in command of that football game versus Georgia for like 90% of it. And that's the separator with Georgia, is just how they finish, the resiliency of how they finish football games. So Ole Miss wins on the road versus Oklahoma 34-26. Are you not entertained? I had a lot of Oklahoma people saying, have you watched Oklahoma's defense? Yes. Have you watched Oklahoma's offense? Have you? Have you watched how heavily dependent they are on John Mateer? Go look at the rushing attempts versus Texas, Michigan, and one or two other games. He had 18 to 20 attempts or so versus the other running backs having 10 to 11 or 9. So, and they're doing split back carries, I believe, but there's not much of a rushing. They're just too heavily dependent on John Mateer, who is taking a beating this year in terms of rushing attempts, in terms of sacks, in terms of surgeries. So, Ole Miss did their job. Number 6, and the top 6 has kind of stayed the same teams for the last 3 weeks. But number 6 is Georgia Tech. They're the only undefeated ACC football team left in their conference. I got it written down here. Run the damn ball, Bert. That is what they do. They are a smash mouth football team. They used to be that triple option, team that you were like, they're still running the veer. Man, they run the triple option well, but they're 5-7. Now it's the revival of Haynes King, who was taken on by Texas A&M, a big time recruit out of Longview, Texas, out of East Texas, and Jimbo just was like, let's find a way to screw up his throwing motion, and let's take the dual threat quarterback that you are and turn you into a purebred pocket passer, and that turned into losing to Appalachian State at home in the SEC. So the revival of him is ever since he's been to Georgia Tech. It's kind of like a Jared Goff scenario in terms of NFL. It's like, okay, yeah, he was mediocre on the Rams, and then you get him with somebody that exploits his best attributes as a quarterback. And since he's been on the Lions, he's been phenomenal. I mean, he's taken a poverty franchise into competency, into relevancy, such as what Haynes King is doing for Georgia Tech. He's leading the team in rush touchdowns with 12. He's leading the team in rushing with over 650 yards. He has 7 passing touchdowns, so close to 20 total 20 total touchdowns on the year, and they're undefeated. And what Georgia Tech does phenomenally is they finish the game. They finish football games well. They have had a couple really close games. Duke was kind of like a trap game, and they pulled away at the end. They had a close game with Clemson when they were relevant at the beginning of the year. They pulled away at the end to get the win. They took control of the lead early on, and they continued to hammer and run the football, clock management, game management. They're not going to score a boatload of points every game. They're not the way they're tailored. They're going to run the football, and I keep saying that, but that's what they do. Number 5, Georgia. Georgia did not move. They're on a bye week, 7-1. They just come off a victory versus Ole Miss. Number 4 is Alabama. Now, we did a little flip-flop here. I'm going to outline the top 4. Alabama, number 4. Indiana, number 3. Texas A&M, number 2. And Ohio State, number 1. Now, last week, if you were paying attention, I had Alabama over Texas A&M based on their wins. Now, Alabama did just win another time. Their fifth straight SEC victory. And Ty Simpson continues to lead the Heisman race. And I'm not knocking Alabama at all. But, and there is no but here, but I keep saying but. Who's kicking whose butt? 5 straight SEC wins. They won at Georgia. They won at home versus Vanderbilt. They won at Missouri. They won at home versus Tennessee. And now they just won at South Carolina in what is still known as and coined as Cocktober. So a little bit of a trap game there. And South Carolina had the lead late into the fourth quarter, I believe, 22-14 or something or other. And Alabama was able to win that football game 29-22. Resiliency, a lot like what Georgia showed. When you're in trouble, and the SEC, something to note, the SEC, when you watch it, as big as the conference is, as strong as the conference is, it's becoming a premature NFL to where the committee, the fans, the coaches have to get used to the fact that these 2 lost teams are the best teams. These 3 lost teams are the second best teams. And these 4 lost teams are resilient football teams that actually had a pretty good year. And normalizing no more undefeated SEC teams is essential to your rankings, to how you view the football game, and to how you view the rankings, or to how you view the SEC and the conferences. And that's why I have Texas A&M in front of Alabama this week. We'll skip over Indiana. They had their biggest wins are against Oregon, Illinois, and Iowa. They're going to be coasting the rest of the year, and they look absolutely strong. They look like every bit of as advertised under Kirk Cignetti and Fernando Mendoza. And there's not much to exploit there, but Indiana did drop a spot from 2 to 3, and that's because in the head-to-head hypothetical, the way I've seen Texas A&M play, and they're kind of the highlight of my list this week. Obviously, they stole the headlines on Saturday, but that's why I have Texas A&M in front of Alabama. They are the last remaining SEC undefeated team. That's a big deal. That is a big deal. 8-0 on the year. It's the first time since like 1992 that they've been 8-0. We talked about, the mainstream media talked about how Texas A&M hasn't been able to win on the road versus a ranked opponent in God knows how long. And they did it against Notre Dame at the beginning of the year, and they were like, holy shit, a goose egg, right? They're like, we just did that. Buzzer beater touchdown, 41-40. We just hung 41 on Notre Dame on the road and won. How can we carry this and develop this into a big-time season? Well, you can go on the road, and this long road stretch that they're on now, you can go on the road to Death Valley and LSU and absolutely beat the brakes off of them and demoralize their fan base to the point where they fire Brian Kelly. Their running back is now resting for the rest of the year to figure things out. You bench Nussmeier in the fourth quarter, which granted he should have came out a lot earlier. The game was just over by then. And their entire stadium was empty by the start of the fourth quarter. That is a statement win. And I'm an Aggie. I'm not going to sit here and say and just like overly react about how this never happens for Texas A&M and then act like this is like, have you ever seen some type of fan where it's like, okay, that's, act like you've been here before. You've heard that term before. Act like you've been here before. A&M really hasn't been there before. And, you see a lot of chicks, posting on their stories, you see a lot of people posting their story and talking all that smack and, and using Barstool A&M as like a tool to troll LSU fans. And you're like talking to yourself, basically. Don't listen to that noise. Don't listen to that noise. That's why you come here. What we saw versus Texas A&M and LSU was a culture change. That's what we're witnessing. We have seen Mike Elko completely shatter the script on Texas A&M's program. And it's ever since he basically threw that chair on the sideline. And they were great last year. I mean, they dropped an OT loss versus Auburn, and then they dropped a game away on the road versus South Carolina, who finished 9-3 last year. And then they lost a close one versus Texas. And then Notre Dame earlier in the year. And Notre Dame was in the national championship. So you finished 8-5 after a bowl game. But throughout the year, you're flip-flopping quarterbacks. So as a coordinator, that's extremely challenging for Colin Klein to go, are we going with Connor Wegman or are we going with redshirt freshman Marcel Reed? Which one is it? Oh, Wegman's like 1 for 30 on the day passing. Okay, let's throw in Marcel Reed. Okay, Marcel Reed doesn't really know how to hit the second level. And they know he's tipping his passes with flat-footed, it's a run. Slanted-footed, it's a pass. Okay, we're in trouble. We'll address that next year. Will they address it next year? We're riding with Marcel Reed the entire year. You have to game plan for Marcel Reed the entire year. And what we're seeing is Marcel Reed with outstanding weapons, outstanding running game, and most importantly, Cassius Howe, the edge rusher for the Texas A&M Aggies. If you have not seen that clip of him dogging the LSU tackle prior to making a sack against Nussmeier earlier on in the game, the attitude, the culture, the preparation, dude, it was all there. That type of mentality is what any SEC team really needs is to say, I want it more than you. And so that's what Texas A&M showed. I mean, they were going into the half, a very bizarre first half, by the way, if you didn't watch it. Very bizarre. It was like A&M just trucking down the field, interception in the end zone. And then another tip pick on a wide open receiver on the right side. And then a kickoff return from LSU that puts them inside whatever plus territory, and you're like, oh crap, we're losing the lead. Something feels bizarre. 35 unanswered points in the second half. 35 unanswered points. Demoralized. And then number one, not much to say there. Ohio State. They're on a bye week. And I said this last week, this is just one of those matchups. This is one of those teams, go watch the NFL team. If you're an Ohio State fan, I know you probably don't want to watch the Bengals if you're in Ohio and you're an Ohio fan, but go watch the NFL. Go watch Joe Flacco rip it. Chill. Relax on Saturdays. If you got a wedding, attend it. You want to go to the farmer's market with your girlfriend? Go to the farmer's market. You got some HEB cleaning to do? HEB grocery store shopping, car wash. You want to bump your credit score a little bit. You want to go on a little trip. You want to go hunting. Perfect time. If you're a big hunter, go hunter. Or go hunting. You got nothing to worry about until you play Michigan. Unless you just want to count Penn State, who fired their head coach and their starting quarterbacks out for the year. Unless you want to count that. But that wraps up the top 25 for the STS Poll Week 10. Oh, there it is. Gosh, I'm like sitting here trying not to end the episode. I'm trying to just get rid of the STS Poll. I'm not the most technologically sound, but I did make that graphic, so suck my ass. Okay, couple of key notes here. We're going to talk Brian Kelly and Lane Kiffin a little bit. I already talked about in a previous episode that Lane Kiffin is one of my favorite coaches in the SEC. I like his charisma. And so there's been a lot of noise around, will Lane Kiffin leave Ole Miss? I don't think so. I think that's a shot in the dark. I think that's just kind of throwing a name out there and saying, an SEC job opened, get Lane Kiffin. LSU's job opened, that just opened up. Brian Kelly's fired. Their first call should be Lane Kiffin. No. Are we stupid? Lane Kiffin is in the conference at Ole Miss. And he's having success with Ole Miss. Now, they have not won an SEC championship. They have, in a while. They have not been to a national championship. But like I've been mentioning earlier, if there is any time to have faith in a coach that goes 9-3, 10-2 practically every year, or at worst, he goes 8-4. If there's any time to do that, and you have a great coach in Lane Kiffin in comparison to most of the other SEC teams, it's right now. It's in the NIL era. It's in the era where the scales have balanced. It's in the era where the SEC conference has turned into a premature NFL, like I mentioned before. It's in the era that the committee, the fans, the coaches, and all these people have to evaluate the SEC and Big Ten and all these conferences at a different level to say that the SEC is not going to have undefeated teams anymore. So everyone's going to be given an opportunity. The expanded playoffs, which was not there when Lane Kiffin first got to Ole Miss. There are more opportunities to convert and to win and to go on streaks and to have a better resume. This is not the time to make that switch if you're Ole Miss. I have to preach that. It is not the time. What is the point of Lane Kiffin? If you are Lane Kiffin, what is the point of you going to LSU? Now it's a top 3 job to take in the national football, or nationally. For sure. I'm not going to argue that. Let LSU figure that out. If anything, bury them when you play them. You beat them early on in the season anyway. If anything, you're a more predominant team and organization and program than LSU is right now. Keep that moral high ground and continue to rock on. And I think the mainstream disagrees with what I just said tenfold. I think they disagree with that. I don't care. And so, alternatively and additionally, Brian Kelly fired at LSU. Now, I'm not going to knock him as a head coach. I think Brian Kelly is a good head coach. I think, he's had successful seasons at LSU. He's only been to bowl games. They struggled in season openers, and there's headliners there where you're like, Brian Kelly's a cornball. Yes, he is a cornball. But I think he's mostly a cornball because he's coaching at LSU. That just was never a fit. And you have heard that before. I'm not going to contradict what the mainstream says about Brian Kelly too far. But I think Brian Kelly is a good coach, but he is a terrible fit for LSU. I saw that when he did the recruiting 360 camera and he's flashing the deuces sign and he's, doing all that stuff like the 80s dances right like awkwardly behind the offensive lineman's like ass. Don't get coaches out of their comfort zone. You're going to look silly. And so Brian Kelly's next step, in my opinion, is I'm searching for an ACC/Big Ten school that has a coach opening. And this is the perfect time of season to really get into that with the coaching carousel that's going to precede us in 2026. Florida's coach was fired, Billy Napier. James Franklin was fired from Penn State. Brian Kelly was fired from LSU. People are going to be calling Dan Lanning. People are going to be calling Tulane's head coach. There's been a lot of job openings that have come up out of the ground. So, and I think I'm missing one or two teams that fired their coaches. So, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting. But if I were Brian Kelly, I'd be looking to the Big Ten. Michigan might fire their head coach. Who knows? Okay. Key projection time, boys. Key projection time. This is where things get interesting because I'm going to take some risks. Ask me if I care. I don't. We did pretty good last week. I predicted the Texas A&M victory over LSU in grand fashion. The analysts predicted the Ole Miss victory over OU in grand fashion. So we're on a little bit of a heater. Now, am I going to screw that up? Maybe. I don't know. But I think I have some good points to make about each of these matchups. Number 9, according to the STS poll, Vanderbilt at 7-1 visits Austin, goes and plays the Texas Longhorns, unranked at 6-2. Arch is in concussion protocol. I think he's listed as probable. I would imagine he passes that process. They had a big time comeback win at Mississippi State, scoring 45 points, winning in overtime. Is the offense clicking? Is it not? We saw the backup quarterback come in and instantly throw a touchdown pass to essentially win them the football game versus Mississippi State. That's something that we don't normally see from Arch Manning throughout the entirety of the season. But when you look at Texas outside the Mississippi State game, the defense is a pretty predominant SEC defense. And so is Vanderbilt's. Vanderbilt has done a phenomenal job on defense so far this year, And, I already talked about Diego Pavia, really being almost a problem child in a way. It's like, okay, you're being mentored by Johnny Manziel. And that goes to say, like, okay, Johnny Manziel is telling you the things that you should not do that Johnny Manziel did do in college, but then you're wearing, like, gold chains and boasting about your own performances in a way. And you should absolutely have that confidence in yourself. But I'm a bigger fan of silent confidence, to say, like a Ty Simpson, to say, should you be the Heisman? And Ty Simpson goes, well, I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about winning football games and winning a national championship. And then they asked Diego Pavia the same question. Hell yeah, I'm a Heisman. Hell yeah, for sure. I got to win some more games. He didn't even say that. He was like, I want to win more football games, but hell yeah, I'm a Heisman. Look at my stuff. Look at my collar. Look at my sleds. Look what I'm wearing today. I don't like that. But that has nothing to do with Vanderbilt's performance. Vanderbilt's performance is, they just upgraded their stadium. They got more people. They're like 80,000 in attendance now. Like, there's more that goes into Vanderbilt than meets the eye. But Pavia's been effective on the ground. So, and I mentioned this. I took a note of this. I'm going to say it again. Guys, have we looked at Diego Pavia's passing stats compared to Arch Manning? Again. Linda, listen. Linda. I'm not a basic stat comparison guy, Linda. What I am telling you today, they have the same amount of passing touchdowns and the passing interceptions and the passing yards and the passing completions as Arch Manning, who you have complained about on the social media for too long now, multiple weeks, okay? So what I'm going to tell you today is Texas Longhorns are going to win this football game. What? Jared, what the fuck? Texas Longhorns win this game 23-17. 23-17. Inciting SEC chaos. Yeah. It's a big time prediction, boys. I'm comfortable with it. I'm just staring at it to make sure I'm not stupid. Texas is winning that football game at home. Take a minute to breathe that one in. Okay, the SEC, number 17 via STS rankings at number 18 via STS rankings. Oklahoma, number 17 at number 18, Tennessee. Both teams 6-2, both desperately needing a win. And here's what I have written here. Unstoppable force, Tennessee's offense, meets an immovable object, OU's defense. If you're Oklahoma, these defensive coordinators know that you heavily depend on John Mateer to do the job for you. That you heavily depend on John Mateer to run the ball, to pass the ball, to move the offense. Okay. Let's go then. Bust the cap open for John Mateer offensively with nothing to lose. Joey Aguilar is going to go empty the tank, per usual. He's going to play well. He's going to play efficient. He has one of the best SEC numbers so far this year as a quarterback. They quite literally made the absolute right decision in the transfer portal after they lost Nico Amaliva. So I think it's going to be a very, very close game. It needs to be. And Oklahoma's going on the road, and I guarantee. And I don't know the line. I don't promote gambling or anything like that. I don't promote degeneracy, but I want to say Tennessee is probably going to be favored. But defense wins championships. We ignored that versus Ole Miss because I believe Ole Miss is the more complete team. But Oklahoma is desperately needing a win. I think they can steal one here. I think Oklahoma wins this game on the road, 28-24. But then I think Tennessee, after they lose this game, wins out, and they finish 9-3. So, and Tennessee has a schedule where they play SEC games earlier in the season, so they might be a little bit more battle-ravaged, and they head into a bye week, I believe, after this week. It just seems like the perfect opportunity for Tennessee to lose. I could be wrong, but I'm going to ride with OU on this one, and 28-24 in a very close ball game. I would not be shocked if Tennessee wins this football game. Like I said, taking a little bit of risk. I'm taking two former Big 12 teams to win over SEC teams that are proponently ranked and built this year. So, all right, two unranked opponents, but I think it's worth noting because I believe USC is still ranked on the current AP poll, which is dumb. But USC at 5-2, at Nebraska at 6-2. Now, this is kind of a short and sweet one. USC is coming off a bye week. They played 3 great quarters of football at Notre Dame. If you did not watch that game, Notre Dame had the lead 24-21, and then instantly Jadarian Price takes one back for a touchdown at 100 yards on the kickoff return, and then USC fumbled, USC threw a pick, and then it just kind of climbed further and further away until it was unreachable. Then it started raining. So 34-24, they lost that game versus Notre Dame, but they played 3 great quarters of football, and that's worth noting. And they were formerly STS-ranked team. Nebraska, I have written it down here, and I'm sorry to the boys in the sort of off-putting subsidiary mainstream media that are now acquiring mainstream media rights with ESPN, to bust them at the boys. I'm sorry, Will Compton. Nebraska does not beat good teams. So USC is winning this football game 34-27 in a close one. And USC, like, I had them closely, not favored, but I had them closely playing with Notre Dame before they lost. So, and I had Notre Dame winning that football game, but it was close. I had a close projection for it. But I think USC climbs out and wins this football game. I just don't trust Nebraska versus competent teams. They can beat those evenly record teams, but I don't think they can beat those winning record teams. Number 15, Cincinnati via the STS poll at 7-1, visiting Utah at 6-2. Now, Cincinnati has the better record, but I don't believe they have the better resume. And I know that's kind of awkward saying that, but then having Cincinnati ranked and then Utah not ranked, but Utah was ranked before this last week. They were ranked, I think, exactly where Cincinnati was ranked, or is currently ranked, because the Holy War was last week. So I see that. I think Cincinnati is still a very good football team. If you haven't watched the film on Cincinnati's quarterback, he looks like a young Aaron Rodgers. He looks good. He's got a very fluid throwing motion. And so I had this quote here from Star Wars that I kind of associates with this football game is, Cincinnati, we elect you to this council, but we do not grant you the rank of master. As in, like, the Revenge of the Sith Star Wars classic, and then Cincinnati's like, wait, what? We're 7-1. We're ranked. What? Utah's a better football team right now. Utah has played both top Big 12 contenders, Texas Tech and BYU, already. So they've seen the best of the Big 12. They could have beaten BYU in that methodical game and the lethargic game. They played close to 3/4 of really, really, really close football due to penalties and fumbles and interceptions and turnovers and things like that. But in it ultimately being on the box score blown out by Texas Tech. I think they're hungry for a win after losing the Holy War by just 3 points. And I think Utah wins this game 26-23 and kind of starts to attack that third place in the Big 12 and has a tiebreaker over Cincinnati. But I still think Cincinnati is going to be a good football team. And if this one is close, I'm still going to have Cincinnati ranked within the top 25. I've really enjoyed what they're doing over there. So, but anyway, those are my key projections. I've got Cincinnati winning, I got USC winning, I've got OU winning, and I've got Texas winning. So call me crazy, but we'll see how this week goes, and I'm excited to see another round of college football. There's kind of the last 2 weeks that there's been less and less quality football games, and I think that's because big branded teams are a little off-put this year in terms of where they should be. So, but I'm very, very excited. I'm looking forward to it. I really enjoyed doing this ranking. My contributors and friends and family looked at it and said we agree. That there was not much editing I had to do to it. So, but like I said, every Tuesday, or if you're first time listener, if you made it this far to the show, I really appreciate you joining. You can subscribe to the channel at Shatter the Script. We release college football episodes every Tuesday, NFL episodes most of the time every Thursday, unless we're kind of thrown off schedule. We try and time it to where the relevancy still is attached to each and every matchup and each and every week. So NFL episodes are on Thursdays. Both are 30 minutes to an hour. College football runs longer because there's so much more to go in depth with now that I've made the top 25 list. You can listen to our episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Our Spotify account does support video, so you'll see all of our episodes released there. And then there'll be 30 to 60-second clips released on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter for bite-sized content as well. And then keep in mind the STS segments. This is a popular thing within my channel. They're 3 to 5 minute segment clips, spotlighting and headlighting the best topics within each episode. So that's something to keep in mind. And there'll be some for this episode as well. And usually it's 4 to 5 clips and simple, easy. Can't catch a full episode. Watch a 3 to 5 minute clip on the way to work and say, "Oh, I want to hear him talk about Texas A&M." Flip it on. But anyway, I appreciate the support. I'll see you guys next Tuesday, and we'll continue to shatter the script as the season goes on. I'm your host, Jared May. Thanks for joining in. I'll see y'all later.